Today, I'm going to tell you the best GPUs performance to value that you can buy in November of 2022. To make it easy, we're going to say the best for 1080p, 1440p, and the best for 4K. We're going to look at real price data, the average numbers, as well as some performance data so you have some metrics to compare. Of course, we're going to be covering both AMD and Nvidia, all the way down from sort of the cheaper GPUs to the more expensive ones. Even Intel ARC, tell you if that's worth it at any price point. So first, let's start off with 1080p. A lot of people still play at 1080p. Often you can't really even notice the difference. A lot of these 1080p monitors are fantastic, and high refresh rate for competitive gaming, of course, is very, very important. First, let's talk about under $200. Now, we're going to talk about both the used market, and you got to keep in mind that the newer retail prices, even though these are mostly a little bit older GPUs, it's going to be a little bit more expensive, but the price should be fairly close. So used market prices, we're going to reference this. This was a Reddit user that does a little bit of research. He actually does it for like mining GPUs to see where they went after mining stopped, which is very interesting for gamers because we get to see some of the price data. So I'm going to reference him here. His name is RX Brad. Under $200, we're going to have the RX 6600 from AMD. Average selling price used is roughly $173. And yes, you can buy these news as well for a little bit over $200. Now, this GPU is definitely a very good performer at 1080p, much better than the 6500 XT. I really wouldn't even look at that GPU. The only competition it may have in this range would be the Nvidia 3050, but I think if you can get this one at a cheaper price, I would go entry-level 1080p 6600 or the 6600 XT if you can find it. That's going to be a fantastic entry-level GPU, and it's going to give you a pretty nice 1080p performance. Now, if you want to do really high refresh rate 1080p with everything maxed out, you may have to step it up a little bit, and your budget may also have to go up. That's when we're going to be looking at the 3060 Ti level GPUs. Now, a 3060 is a good GPU, don't get me wrong. It has more VRAM, which doesn't really matter at this level than the 3060 Ti, but if you can find it for around $300 or so, with that low 300 range, the 3060 Ti is going to be one of the best bang for the bucks for 1080p. It's going to excel at even higher refresh rate gaming, and it's more like a cut down 3070 rather than a 3060. It's a different class entirely than the 3060. And of course, priced somewhere in this $300 range, you're going to run it into AMD's 6700 XT. This really isn't that bad of an idea. It's not like you're going to be doing much ray tracing at this level anyway, and the rasterization performance actually gets close to a 3070, which is a more expensive GPU, and you can get this a little bit cheaper if you can go to AMD side rather than Nvidia. But if we're talking about 1080p high refresh rate gaming with sort of a lot of the eye candy turned on, you definitely want to maybe step towards that 3060 Ti 6700 XT type of level. Now, a 3070 starts to get a little bit more expensive for that type of level, but it's going to give you fantastic performance, and it's going to future-proof a little bit as well if you want to step into 1440p later on. But keep in mind, you're going to be paying a little bit higher price. Not that it's overkill at 1080p. You can still hit some really high frames with the 3070, but you can certainly make do with the 3060 Ti as well. But given that the 3070 has fallen under that $400 mark, especially for the used market, you can find some new ones probably for, $50, $60 more if you really search as well. Given that, it's going to be one of the best performers overall for 1080p, especially higher refresh rate, 144 hertz and above. And like I said, it's also a great stepping point when you upgrade into the future. As you get above a 3070 level, unless you want to do really high refresh rate like 360 hertz and you want to be extremely competitive and just get ridiculous frames, I don't really think the price proposition is really worth it for anything over a 3070. For example, 3070 Ti or maybe even a 6800, you may start to be pushing it a little bit too much. That's when you start getting into our next resolution, and that's going to be the 1440p resolution. Now, here is where things start to get a little bit more saucy. You're going to want to get a little bit more powerful GPU. Now, if you have a budget under $300, will a 3060 or a 6600 potentially work? Yeah, you can do 1440p with those, but you're not going to have the best experience or the highest frame rates if you really want to max things out. As you get to 1440p, I think once again the 3060 Ti still continues to be a very good GPU. Even at this resolution, you may not be able to hit the highest frame rates or even have it on sort of the maxed out settings, but if you tweak the graphic settings a little bit, that's going to be sort of right where the starting line is. Anything above that is going to start to get much better. Like the 3070, I still think is a pretty ideal GPU for 1440p. You're going to get pretty good frames. You know, even if you have a 144 hertz monitor, you may have to tweak the settings a little bit. You can't just throw everything on ultra on every single game, but overall, the 3070, especially under $400, is still going to give you a very good performance at 1440p. You don't have to go crazy. That's a really nice resolution, and you don't need a crazy, 3090 or above for this type of resolution. Now, of course, under $400, you also have this guy behind me here. There's the Intel Arc. Now, there's going to be a few versions, of course, the A770, A750. Even though they can do really well at 1440p, that's maybe like the best resolution that they perform at, it's going to be hit or miss. In some games, they do really well. They're as good as a 3070, if not more. But in other games, it's still buggy, still unstable, and they don't really perform all that well just because the drivers still need time to mature. I'm going to fall short of actually recommending it because there are, used GPUs going down now that are going to be more competitive and just more stable, like the 3070 and 3060 Ti. So 1440p, that's, I think, 3070 once again is going to be one of the best performing GPUs. Now, at 1440p, if you do want to step up your budget a little bit and go into like a 3070 Ti, they're now, as you can see, in the $400 range average. Even at 1440p, you can definitely use a lot of performance. Now you can turn your graphics settings higher, maybe to ultra. Now ray tracing starts to become a little bit more interesting. So if you can find a 6800 XT, you may get better rasterization than a 3070, maybe closer almost, to a 3080 and very competitive. But the only issue is ray tracing is still going to fall below if you want all of the eye candy. For really high refresh rate gaming, that 3070 Ti to sort of that 3080 level with the 6800 XT included is going to be where I consider really sort of like the higher end for 1440p in terms of the performance. With something like a 3080, and you will have to step into that $500 range, the 3080 can definitely be found for under $600, especially on the used market. Some new prices are a little bit more, and of course you have the disparity between the 10 to the 12 gigabyte. If you're looking for the best bang for your buck and you're doing 1440p, I still think the 10 gigabyte 3080 is more than enough. It's not outdated at all. It's going to perform well. You're probably not going to saturate the VRAM in many games unless you really try. So the 12 gigabyte does have some more CUDA cores and it's faster, but it's also going to be more expensive, and maybe I would start focusing on that more towards 4K. So on average for 1440p, 3080 level with the 6800 XT is going to let you pretty much play at the highest settings and fairly high refresh rate. Now, there are some monitors that are hitting 360 hertz, that's 1440p. Something like that, you may need to step up to the really big GPUs, but most people are still using like a 144 hertz with 1440p, and 3080 levels more than enough, and going above $500 to $600 doesn't make as much sense until you start stepping into 4K and things like that. So the biggest difference between the 6800 XT and the 3080 at this level is really going to be in that ray tracing if you're using it purely for gaming. If you really want all of the eye candy, I would just suggest sticking with Nvidia because their ray tracing performance is superior. And then of course you do get DLSS 2.0 on the 3080. AMD has its FSR 2.0. Both are pretty good, but definitely the 3080 will still have an advantage with Nvidia across more titles. That's when we step into 4K, and here pretty much there's no limit. I mean, you can go all the way up to a 4090, but that's not going to be your best performance for the dollar, and often it's going to be overkill. So now that 4K does do 144 hertz, there are many more affordable monitors out there, even TVs that people are using that do like 120 hertz. It's definitely much easier to be gaming in 4K. But then of course the GPU that you need here is going to have to be a lot more demanding. Now, if your budget is under like $400, the 3070 or that level, that's going to be the very minimum to get any type of experience, I think, on 4K that's really going to be worth it. Or else you might as well just step down to 1440p. 3070 certainly definitely will struggle a bit with many games getting 60 frames per second. You're going to have to turn those settings down. So it's not ideal, though you could definitely use it. But I would say you want a minimum of a 3080 to perhaps a 6800 XT at the 4K level. 3070 Ti can kind of do it in the 6800, but 3080 level and above is definitely going to be superior. Here, you're going to be able to do fairly decent frames per second as well. A lot of people may not even reach anything above 60 frames per second, depending on the game, like Cyberpunk. Very difficult to reach very high levels, but you can certainly get playable frames per second with those type of GPUs. And in some games that aren't extremely demanding, you can even start to turn on some of the ray tracing and have some of the better graphics be available to you. Of course, not as much on the 6800 XT. This is really where the 3080 is going to start to shine a little bit. Now, the 4K resolution is where you can really start to step into the GPUs that were really meant for this, especially of the last generation. I think the 3080 Ti is going to be probably the sweet spot for 4K. First, the performance is not that much less than a 3090. It's not that much less than a 3090 Ti even, which is certainly better, but at an increased cost. And you can get a 3080 Ti for that like $700 something range. They've definitely fallen below $800. You're going to get very similar performance to much more expensive GPUs like the 3090, give or take a few percentage points. If you want to do ray tracing, fairly decent refresh rates. Of course, you're not going to be hitting 144 Hz at 4K on most games unless you're doing DLSS or perhaps even using a 4090. That's where really 4K starts to become tamed much more with the newer RTX 4000. But with RTX 3000, I would say the high-end sweet spot is the 3080 Ti. It's really meant for gaming. The 3090 and 3090 Ti, yes, they're a little bit faster. There's no denying that. But they're also built for sort of like a hybrid user that's going to use it for content creation. That's going to be good for somebody who wants to do video rendering and 3D work and things like that. 24 gigabytes of VRAM is just way overkill, where the 3080 Ti has more than enough to really be able to keep up with any game. 3080 12 gigabyte is not a bad GPU if you can get it a little bit cheaper as well, but I would still go for the 3080 Ti. I think that one has depreciated a decent amount right now, and it's still going to give you some pretty good performance at 4K. You're still going to be able to do ray tracing and things like that. If you don't really care about ray tracing and you're playing 4K and you really just want really high frames, I think it's definitely worth a look at the 6900 XT. These have been going for sometimes even cheaper than the 3080 Ti. You can get these in that $600 to $700 range, and even a nice one for a little bit over $700. The 6950 XT has a little more performance, but it's probably not worth the price premium at this point. 6900 XT, you can definitely get it for a good price. The performance at 4K is really, really great. I mean, in some cases, it can even match or beat an RTX 3090, so it can definitely hang with the 3080 Ti, if not beat it in many cases. Then, of course, ray tracing, that's always the caveat when we talk about Nvidia versus AMD, but it's also going to have, FSR 2.0, so it's going to have, equal technologies, a smart access memory if you're using like a Ryzen processor. It's going to have a lot of benefits as well. And for a gaming performance at 4K, and if you want to turn on most graphics on, aside from ray tracing, I still think that's a little bit of a weak point. You can do it. You're just going to struggle at 4K, especially games like Cyberpunk and things like that. Probably better to leave it off unless you step into one of the much more expensive GPUs. So at a price to performance 4K, I do think 3080 Ti would be my pick. It's cheaper than a 3090, and it's going to have a little bit more bells and whistles than a 6900 XT, but that's not a bad second place to look at either if you can do without the ray tracing. Now, obviously, if you want to do the best 4K that you can, the 4090 is definitely the best we've ever seen. The performance is going to be out of this world, not only with ray tracing, but its RTX 4000 has DLSS 3.0, which the other GPUs don't have, because it's going to have much more powerful hardware that can actually do it. So you're going to be able to smash 4K left and right, but you're going to have to pay over $1,600 for it. Now, there are other resolutions as well, and I do use them myself, so I like to mention them so those people don't feel left out. Of course, that's going to be both ultra wide as well as like triple monitor setups for sim racing and flight simulator. Now, a lot of the same things will apply to these. If you're doing like a 34-inch ultra wide, that's somewhere between 1440p and 4K, so the same thing would apply. Something like a 3080 Ti really is going to give you the best bang for the buck. If you're doing something like the 49-inch ultra wide, then you're going to start start to get more into the 4K territory, not to mention sort of triple monitor setups. For example, I'm running 10,240 by 1440p. That's going to be 3 monitors, technically 4, with that Samsung 49-inch ultra-wide in the middle, 227 inches on the side. Effectively, it's going to be 4 1440p monitors, something like that. A 4090 definitely is really useful, especially if you're running like a Assetto Corsa, Microsoft Flight Simulator, just because it's so many pixels across those monitors. So if you're running a traditional 1440p triple monitor, once again, I would say look at least 4K as your benchmark. I would say, 3080 Ti is once again going to be the sweet spot for that. Going further, one note to mention is the CPU. If you're going to be using 1080p and 1440p, definitely have a pretty powerful CPU, something that's really fast, like from the newer Intel or Ryzen 5000. Intel, the 11th, 12th, 13th generation are all going to do great. 4K, the CPU isn't as important, but you would think you would want a powerful CPU anyway. One exception is actually the 4090, which has started bottlenecking at 4K some CPUs, making you almost have to get like a 13900K or a 7900X if you want to guarantee that it's never bottlenecked. And then of course, a note for like content creators, people that are doing 3D graphics, video rendering, and of course streaming as well. Typically Nvidia will be sort of the best that you're going to choose there compared to AMD, but in some cases AMD could be good as well, but that's going to be more geared towards gaming at this point. Nvidia still has the lead in things like Blender, so that's something to keep in mind. Even the Intel Arc GPUs with their AV1 encoding has been pretty interesting for content creators. At this point, if you see similarly priced GPUs and they're in your budget, I would definitely tend towards Nvidia if you're doing content creation and not just gaming, just because it's still going to be the better performer unless you get one of the very new next generation that are coming out. Let me know what you guys think down below. Remember to subscribe, smash that like button, and I'll see you guys on the next video.